back. In this section, we're going to explore the cerebral blood supply and drainage. So let's start first with arterial blood flow because it's quite unique. So we are talking about blood flow going inside the skull to the brain itself. And the first blood vessels we have come up through the cervical spine on each side through those transverse foramina. And this blood vessel, which travels through the neck, is known as the vertebral artery. Once it reaches C1, the vertebral artery then travels medially and enters the skull on each side through the foramen magnum. So you have two vertebral arteries, which you can first see inside the skull, just underneath the medulla oblongata. Now these two arteries are going to fuse into one artery, and this is a super rare occurrence because, as you recall, arteries tend to branch and get smaller and smaller, and this is one place where they're going to do the opposite. And so now you have one blood vessel traveling just under the surface of the pons, and this part is known as the basilar artery. When the basilar artery gets below the diencephalon, it's going to do a branching, and it's going to form part of a structure we're going to get to shortly because we need to talk about the other blood vessels that are sending blood into that structure. And those other blood vessels are your two internal carotid arteries. So as you recall, the internal carotid arteries enter the skull through the carotid canals. And then here is where they appear just lateral to where the optic tracts are located. Can you see them right there in the pink? So this picture on the right is a very good one because you can see vertebral arteries forming the basilar artery, and then you can see the two internal carotid arteries. So now we have three arteries which are all going to send blood into this circular structure known as the circle of Willis, sometimes called the cerebral arterial circle. And this is a circular structure which goes completely around where the optic chiasm and pituitary gland is located. So when those structures are present, you really can't clearly see it. So in order to understand what's happening, let's look at this left picture where you see the two internal carotid arteries and the basilar artery all being tagged. And so what's happening from each of these, blood is going to both the right and the left. And therefore, blood can travel in a circular pathway before branches come off to go to the brain. And so this is an advantage because it means if there is a partial blockage going this way, traffic jam, that means blood can come from the other direction to supply that brain. And coming off of the circle of Willis is where we have all the blood vessels that go to the brain itself. For instance, we have some anterior cerebral blood vessels which go to the frontal lobes. We have some more posterior ones which go like occipital lobe. We have some cerebellar ones, and then we have middle ones which go to like the temporal and parietal lobes. So that's how blood gets to the brain. Now, exiting the surface of the brain, we do have veins on the surface of the brain. You clearly could see them in the spaces in the arachnoid mater. And then we also have veins draining the meninges. But in order to drain all these tissues, that venous blood drains into structures which do not have the three tunic layers, so cannot be called veins. We're going to use that other term, sinus. Because where these are going to drain into are sinuses, which are places filled with venous blood that are between the two layers of the dura mater that you find in the skull. You don't find it in the spinal cord, but you find it in the skull. And so the largest one of these is known as the superior sagittal sinus. So it sits the superior border of the falx cerebri, right there where the longitudinal sulcus is located. And so it's going to be draining blood from the brain below as well as from the meninges itself. And blood flows from an anterior direction back posteriorly. And then there is also a smaller inferior sagittal sinus in this location, which would then travel posteriorly and join up to the superior sagittal sinus. And if you see this area right there, that's right off your occipital prominence. So that's kind of a good external landmark for knowing where all this blood is collecting inside your skull. And from there, and this has a red slide because it's not on your list, but I want to show you what happens. So here's where all the blood traveled to, and then it goes laterally between the cerebrum and the cerebellum and goes in that groove in the occipital bone, which leads to the jugular foramen. And so once the blood has gone through the jugular foramen, it is then in the internal jugular vein. So it's the two internal jugular veins which are draining all the blood from within the skull. And with that, we are done with our cerebral blood flow. Thank you, and I'll see you shortly.